Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for attending today's webinar on design history file for reusable medical devices. You might be wondering, why are we talking about design history file when it comes to reusables? There is a lot of work that's happening today in that field, and today I'm going to go over that. Standards, as we all know, have been governing how the testing is being implemented and being put forth for reusable devices, and have taken priority for regulatory all over the world. Active work around reusable medical devices have challenged the medical device industry to think differently from what they have currently been accustomed to. What we used to rely on a few years ago is no longer current, and things are moving in such a fast-paced form that if you are not caught up to what's happening in the current world with reusables, you will be left behind very far. A lot of standards have been updated regarding MDRs, ISO, AAMI, ASTM documents are also taking a step forward in how these validations will affect your design history file and what you need to consider when it comes to validations for these devices. Which brings into question also predicate devices. What are we looking for predicate devices? This presentation will also go into technological innovations, design and function features of these devices, and which has advanced, and how are you going to catch up with those advances, and how will you bring those into current standards that you have used worst case devices or predicate devices before a certain time period that you're still using for your new products that you are bringing. We will also go over certain things like what does the design history file for verification and validations include? Protocols and reports. What do you need in your protocols and reports to keep this going, right? Single-use devices. What is the impact of single-use devices with the design history file? Legacy products. There's tons of legacy products out there that are still being used that we know validations were not performed for. So how does that impact you, and how does that impact MDR? Impact on 3D printed devices. We're seeing this generation moving towards 3D printing devices, and we're seeing more and more of those in the reusable world as well, just not implants, but more and more on reusables, and how do we overcome those factors? Also, impact of EU MDR. What does that impact happen for reusables? There is a huge section in there just on reusables, and where does that take you, and what is that you need to use for validations? Now, for a quick definition for design history file, it's a collection of documents that describe the design of your finished product. What did it take for you to start to the end for your product? And you have to have that compilation of documents in your design portfolio. And that's what this design history file contains. Your user needs to your design input, your design processes, your output, all of that is involved. And most important, your verification and your validation to show that the devices that you have created or designed can be verified and validated to who you are selling this to, for the user end, for the physician. What is this device being used for? Those validation criteria are there and are adequate. And most importantly, you want to ensure that these design controls that you have implemented for your processes, your verification and your validation definitely meet the FDA requirements, or the country you are planning to file for. That'd be EU, TGA, Japan, China, wherever. There are slightly different variations to these validations from country to country, as we all know, and how you can optimize those variations to ensure that your validation plan is adequate and you have all the acceptance limits specified in your design history file. Now, some of the contents of the design history file has for medical devices in general, you would see design and development planning, like we talked about in the previous slide, user needs, design inputs, design outputs, verification, protocol reports, design validation, and I've highlighted those two because that is going to be the key of what I'm going to be talking about today, because that is what we're worried about. We're worried about what are the validations we need to perform. Are we outdated? Are we in there? What risks do I need to mitigate? So that's what I'm going to focus my discussion today on. But though that's why they're highlighted. But the rest also are very important to ensure that they are in your design history file and they're composed in that area, right? You also have to make sure that you have a risk management file, your design requirement matrix. All of those are all important factors when you put all this into play. Now, conformance, big thing. Obviously, we have to have conformance to all the standards, and especially FDA. There are important things that you have to checkbox, and some of the things that are quite important is that for design history files, you have to have a design plan. That includes a validation protocol. You have to have a validation protocol established and in your design history file, not just signed by you, excuse me, but signed by the facility that's performing the validation. You want to ensure that all of the factors that we talked about in the previous slide with the inputs and outputs and how are they being verified, how are they being validated, are included in your file and your design validation protocol, right? So that is what I'm referring to when I say requirements for FDA. And also ISO, if you see ISO 13485, that is our governing standard that talks about quality systems. And you want to make sure that the file will include, I mean, I put shall here so you can see that shall means you have to have it. Records that are generated to demonstrate conformity to requirements for design and development and all the changes. But when it says design and development, that means design and development of the protocol that you're using to execute for the verification and the validations you are performing to make sure that all of the criteria are met. Now, the must-have list for design history file considerations. You can see that I've got a gap, right? You have to do a gap assessment. And if you haven't done it already, I strongly encourage that you look into your folders, go back and look into your folders and see what gaps am I missing. And if you don't have your regulatory quality assurance department that is capable of doing that or do understand all those standards that are associated with reusable medical devices, because it is a niche in the business where not everybody knows about it. There are other people that can help you, and Nelson Labs is one that can help you do these gap assessments as well. But you always want a gap assessment or a risk assessment when you have a device change, right? If you have a design change, you definitely need that. Raw materials, it's a must. Changing testing methodologies. This is where we hit reusable medical devices. Changes in testing has happened in the last decade exponentially. Things have changed every 2 years. And if you're not up to date on the changes, then you're already outdated. So you want to make sure that you're involved in standard development changes that are happening for reusable devices, if that is what you're looking at. Updates on standards used for validation. Reusable device is huge, right? And it is changing very, very fast. And it's like the devices are used in a fast-paced situation, the standards are also moving in a very fast-paced situation. So you want to understand all the changes that are happening and how you can do these gap assessments along the side, not after the fact, but along the side. Validity of the master product. These are your master products that you established. And if you establish the master products, let's say a couple of years ago, it may not have the same test methods that are currently being used today. So how are you going to do a risk assessment that even with those changes, this still is my master product? Those are the things I'm talking about when I'm talking about gap assessments. Validity of the reference product, right? When you do your 510K, you have your predicate device that you're designing against, and you're also using some of the testing data that they have, saying that it is equivalent to all this, and this is what we're doing. you want to make sure that those are also compliant and those are current, because those are very old and they have changed over time as well. So you want to make sure that you are on top of that. Periodic review, I cannot emphasize more about periodic reviews. This should be done at least 5 years. For reusables, you know, maybe every 3 years is a good mark, that at least to go back and look at, because we're moving so fast in standards, that you want to go back and see what you're validating, and is it still compliant? Yeah, the test method is still compliant. Is the master product compliant to what we're testing right now? So those are the things. And validation reports, your legacy products. You want to look at your legacy products. Back in the day, I remember when I started in 2003, when we used to get validations, we only did steam sterilization. We didn't do cleaning, because cleaning was just a little paragraph that said follow hospital practices for cleaning of the device, and then steam sterilization you would have to validate. So that was back 20 years ago. And so you can just imagine that 20 years ago, we left our instruments to be cleaned by healthcare facilities, and today we have stringent validation criteria for cleaning validations. So we have changed a lot. And in between, which I will go through the presentation, you will see where those changes have happened. Now for reusable devices, if you don't know, these are devices that are used repeated on patient. So they're used on one patient and then used on the second patient, but between that time you have to clean and disinfect, or clean and sterilize these devices. And so how can I make these devices used over and over and over again? By building also safety in there. And so that is where we have started to see where before we relied on the healthcare practices to figure out how to clean your product. Now we're actually giving them instructions on how to clean their product. And are we building safety measures in these validation plans to ensure if something went wrong, is it still safe to be used on patient? And this is where the validation realm comes in. Now, medical devices, these are huge, but when it comes to reusables, we do have our little area that we do still see. And surgical instruments are reusable, right? Orthopedics, those surgical trays, all reusable devices. ENT devices, ear, nose, throat. Dental is an industry that is now seeing a strict guideline for regulatory. They're actually going in and asking them for validations that was never asked for or required at that point. Yeah, they're reusable and they're used for critical processes, but we didn't have validations, and so now the regulatory is definitely hitting the dental industry hard. Respiratory devices, flexible endoscopes, of course, that's been a high topic in the last in the last decade. So we're going to see more and more on that for sure. Capital equipment, this is something that we're seeing daily increase, and stuff that we didn't validate before and asked healthcare facilities to just take care of, because, you know, lights and equipment that is helping facilitate critical procedures, those equipment need validations now. So those are the things that we're starting to see. And yes, in 2021, it was pretty clear in the standard that that is what they want. Robotic devices, that's an industry that's growing exponentially, and it's growing very, very fast. And so we're seeing more and more robotic devices come through, but they come with their own challenges for validations and simulated use cycles that we have to follow. They have their own challenges on how we're supposed to challenge these devices as well. So depending on the criticality of the product, the validation changes as well. Dialysis machines, we're seeing a lot of traction in those areas. Anything that's water irrigation devices, we're seeing regulatory asking for validations for that. That's also your air purifiers that you have, or your humidifiers that you have in the hospital that you supply. You may have just take the water out, but take the water out, replace it, but you have to have a disinfection cycle, because over time in a healthcare facility, if you have stagnant water just sitting around, you will start to have a buildup of organisms. Now you're just proliferating all these organisms out as well. So you have to have a disinfection process to accommodate that. We have automated cleaning reprocessors, cleaning, and machines that we use that that clean the devices, we also validate that as well. And home care products, right? Baby bottles, glucose monitors, anything that's home care use, CPAPs, those all have to be validated. Now, validation for reusable devices that you definitely should have in your design history file is you have to have a cleaning validation. That's a must. And then you divide. If your devices cannot go through sterilization, then they'll go through disinfection. And so it's not both, but it's one or the other you should have. And for the disinfection, you have chemical and physical parameters. And then for sterilization, for reusable devices, it's usually moist heat, which is steam sterilization, because it's a fast-paced environment for and use for those devices. So we do see more moist heat, but we often see VHP and EO, and we're seeing other modalities make it into this sector, but they haven't made it successfully to compete with moist heat so far. Now, life cycle testing, I'll talk about a little bit, but is it a must or not? That's still a question mark. So we caution on that, but you want to think about it. Is it a requirement for a certain country or a certain continent, or do we take the safety measures? Those are the things you need to evaluate and address in a design history file, why you are not doing these tests. So the must are usually cleaning, disinfection, and sterilization. Now, just to give you an overview of what standards activity are there for reusable devices and what you should consider that your design history file should have for reusable is the MDR, right? You should have that in your design history file for reusable, the applicable parts of the MDR. The standards that were updated in the last 5 years, right, with the ISO standards, AAMI standards, and ASTM standards. You probably want to have all of these in your design history file because they all, except for the endoscope, if you're not doing endoscopes, then that's fine. But the rest of them, you should have it in your file because that is what the whole industry is using to create validation protocols for the design that's been implemented for your product. But these are just the last 5 years standards that have been published. So you can see a lot of work that's happening, and it's still happening. We still have more and more standards that we're opening, and for new items that we need to address. And most are to do with cleaning validations. So it's important that you get familiar with the standards and their updates. And if you don't have them updated, you probably want to pull these, review them, and put a gap analysis between what you have current and what you don't, and what is current, and see what pieces are missing in there and how you're going to address those. Now, this is an FDA guidance document that was published in 2015. If you all remember, this was a big one that came out. And this one actually talked about everything that we have for validations for reusable devices. They went into cleaning, they went to disinfection, sterilization, and life cycle testing. They didn't go into detail, but they gave a little snippets of what you should do for validation. And it was important to remember that this is what governed the rest of the standards, right? This is what was used as a checklist for regulatory to ensure that we have everything outlined as specified. And so it's if you haven't looked at this document, you want to take a look at this document. And you want to ensure that the day 2015 that's here, anything beyond 2015 is what you will have to assess at the end, because this is where the changes started to occur for reusable medical devices on test methods. So anything that's 2014 and above, you want to start looking and doing your gap assessments at that point for cleaning validations. Now, this is a history that I just want to give an overview of for cleaning validations, because that's what's been impacted the most for reusable devices. The rest has stayed the way it has, but this is what has been impacted the most. AAMI TIR 30, right? It was TIR, it's a technical information report. So it's a recommendation they're giving to the industry on how to perform these validations. In 2003, they started talking about analytical markers. So no longer were we using bacteria or microorganisms as a marker to test for cleaning validation. If you remember back then, we were doing a 3-log reduction. If you got a 3-log reduction of G-Bacillus thermophilus, you're good to go. Or if you got a 3-log reduction of E. coli or S. aureus, you're fine. This document changed that. This document in 2003 said now you have to test for protein and hemoglobin or TOC, and these are the acceptance criteria that you should meet for this validation. So now we're looking at biological markers, right? We're looking at all these analytical tests that we have to do, and this is the start of when this was required. In 2011, it was more included, it was more inclusive. There was more information on what should we do with these analytical markers. How can we assess them? More information was given, not too much, but there was more information in there. And then AAMI ST98, this changed the whole outlook of the 2 documents. And from TIR, it turned into a standard. And everything in the FDA 2015 guidance document was implemented into a standard now. So now we have a standard that we have to use for cleaning validations, and that was published in 2022 of August. So this is the standard that if anything you want to remember for cleaning, that's the standard you want to remember, and make sure that you're compliant to that standard. So like I said previously, that the DHF will need to be re-evaluated 2015 and beyond. So look at all the test methods that you've performed, do a risk assessment, and see if that is something that you need to close your gaps on. Very important that you have that information. And the only reason I'm emphasizing that over and over again is because we've received a lot of calls from customers during their FDA audits. FDA is actually coming to sites and asking for this information. The first thing they see is, can I see a design history file? They open your design history file for reusables, and they look at the standards that you used, and they'll see that it's outdated, and then they'll say, well, these are not compliant to the new current document. Do you have a risk assessment or gap assessment that you did? And if you didn't, that is something that you will have to address. Some of the changes in 2015 document that does impact testing is simulated use cycles were introduced for the first time in the cleaning validation realm. That was a big deal. And what I mean by simulated use cycles is before, when we did validation, say from 2013, 14, we used devices that were provided by the manufacturer and used those devices right out of the box straight to the cleaning validation. When the simulated use cycles came into practice, now the regulatory is asking, you need to use a used condition device for the validation, right? Make it into a used condition. How do you make these devices into used condition? Take it through what the hospital would see, the process. So you would have to contaminate it, clean it, sterilize it for a certain time. And usually that was 6 cycles. And on the 7th cycle is when you would do your cleaning validation on. And did that impact? Yeah, it did impact a lot of devices that we saw. So it was an industrial revolution move, but it was in the right direction and was needed. Detergent residual evaluation after cleaning, that is something that we didn't see either, but was written, but was not performed. It was not actively performed until the last, I think, 5 years is when we started to see a little push towards that, but that is when we started seeing that. Challenge to protocol IFU using worst case parameters. New controls were established for the first time. What these controls mean, we needed controls for everything. And the controls that AAMI TR 12 or AAMI TR 30 2011 specified were not compliant to what the new 2015 were saying. So those controls needed to be placed as well. They discussed on extraction methods and clinically relevant tests. So this is when we started our work in ASTM to start defining what these test cells would look like and how can you use them. And then life cycle considerations, which I'll talk further on. Disinfection validations in this document was not affected. There's still a lot of gray zone in this area, but the recently published GRI 12 document goes over the differences and helps you at least figure out what you need to do for your product and what category it belongs to, so you can go through that and see what tests are required and what are needed for the product if disinfection is your route. Sterilization validations were affected a little bit because now everything had to be FDA cleared. You had to use an FDA cleared supplies, you had to use FDA cleared wrap, you had to use FDA cleared sterilizers for the validation. So that is when we started to see the shift. Now for the current, last year when the document was published for cleaning validations, everything remained the same. The only things that were changed was you had to apply statistical analysis for the test results. So now you have to provide some sort of justification if your replicates are not statistically significant to each other. And the standard does provide lots of examples in there, and they're very good examples and easy to follow. So I highly recommend that you look through that. But in short, it just says take your sample count, get a D value, and apply the D value to your highest analyte marker results that you've received. And if that goes above the acceptance criteria, you will have to repeat the test again. So there is that there, and just if you're not doing that, you probably want to think about why you're not doing that, and have a little paragraph in your design history file for why we're not doing that. And there are pros and cons to both requests, but it is something that you should determine. But everything else remained the same. Extraction efficiencies are required for critical and semi-critical devices, and you have to have 3 positive controls. That was a huge change. Before we only needed 1 positive control. Now we needed 3. Now we need 3 positive controls for critical and semi-critical, and they all have to be above 70%. So those are the things that have changed huge. These are some of the acceptance criteria that are specified in AAMI SST 98 and then ISO 1583 as well. So just to give you an outlook of the acceptance criteria of the analytical tests that are performed, they are very close. They're exactly the same as ISO 1583, but they're just alert and action level. And so if you are submitting to EU, you probably want to assess also the ISO 1583-5 standard in your design history file, and write an example or write a paragraph on how they're relevant still, right? So those are things that you probably want to consider. The one thing that came out really well for AAMI ST 94 manufacturers was for non-critical devices, visual inspection is required. That's it. So no more analytical markers for non-critical devices. Visual inspection suffices everything. So we don't have to do more than that anymore. So that's a plus that came out of this document. And it definitely helps move along these devices that we did testing for that really didn't help mitigate infections or risk or anything. It was just there because we didn't know what to do with it. So I'm glad that this did help the industry move along. Now, risk devices that may need to revisit for design history file, 3D printed devices, like I talked about in the beginning, right? Is it being reused? If it's being reused, you want to make sure it's non-porous. We're using non-porous materials. If it's porous materials, we have to test for detergent residuals, and it will fail because now we have all these detergents absorbed into this material, and when it's extracted out, it will extract those devices out. You also want to make sure that when we're cleaning, say if we do sonication, it doesn't create particulates and doesn't break down. We see that very often. So use methods that are appropriate for that 3D implant. Finishing products for residual testing. And so these are the things. Materials from construction for reusable is huge when you're doing 3D printed devices. And you want to consider all of these. I'm going to tell you, honestly, we do get these all the time. Maybe 1 out of 10 make it through. And so you want to make sure the polymers you're using or whatever mixed material that you're using will withstand the chemicals and will be non-porous and will not soak up all the chemicals that we're using for cleaning. And during cleaning, it will not break down either, because that's what we see as well. Now, single-use devices, can it be reused? I put that question there because we're starting to see the industry move in a direction of green, right? They're calling it green. They're saying we're reusing devices that we're throwing away that can be reused maybe 3 or 4 or 5 times. So why aren't we doing that? So we're seeing your competitors or other companies come in, pull those devices from healthcare, you know, back engineer it, open it up, put new technologies on it that they have built, and resell it back to the hospital under their name, of course, because now they've changed, they've manipulated the product, so now it's their product. But if you have given that opportunity to somebody, why aren't you using that opportunity for yourself to be like, okay, this is single use, but can be reusable up to 5 times. Now keep in mind, materials that are used for single use are not materials that should be used for reusable, because they will break down way quicker than for the time they'll be used. So it's not going to be indefinite. It's probably going to be 3 or 4 times. In my lifetime, 20 years working in this industry, I've only seen 1 or 2 devices that are single use that have made it to reusable, can only be used 10 times. That's it. So materials are not well established for single use that can be used. They're not good materials anyway to be used for reusable anyway. So you probably want to assess how many times it can be used, because somebody else is already doing it right now as we're speaking. So something that you want to think about, you know, for your design history file, keep it open and say, okay, I think this can be reusable. Let's test it 3 or 4 times and say, I have the data that it can be reused 3 or 4 times. Now your device can be used for that many times and not thrown away. Dental devices, like we talked earlier, regulations are starting to question validation studies. They don't have validation studies, but they're using these devices that are going in our mouth, and they're getting hit very hard. And they're just learning what an IFU is. If you go to your dentist, there is one process only: rinse, sonication, sterilize. Same program, same everything. Now, are they validated to that, all those instruments? Probably not, but so these processes are being definitely audited and looked at. Water irrigation devices. These are dialysis machines, heating blankets, humidifiers that are used in healthcare setting. And when you use water, you know that you're having biofilm accumulation as well. And so they want to see biofilm testing now. And we are seeing this go up pretty fast. So any water irrigation devices, it's a caution that you address this in your design history file. And if you have just if these machines are sitting for weeks or even days before use or a week before use, you have to have some sort of process to kill bacteria in there, and they are requiring a disinfection validator. They're asking for a validation for that. So that is your design input validation for your design history file. So just to keep that in mind. Capital equipment, these are equipment that are just in the OR sitting on the side, helping devices that are used in critical procedures. They definitely need validations and have been for a couple of years, but we're seeing more and more. I just saw yesterday, I was down in the lab and I saw a monitor, a huge monitor that's a touch screen, and they use it in the OR during when they're putting devices in to see, but sometimes they touch those screens during surgery, and when you touch those screens, now you've contaminated that screen with blood. Now, how are you cleaning that off? That is the manufacturer's responsibility to address that question. Non-critical devices, I just touched on that before, where only visual inspection is required. I put some stuff here that goes over all the different standards that are now accepting that visual inspection is sufficient for non-critical devices. It is something that we have been looking forward to for a long time, and it finally made it in 2021. So we're excited about that. And it's also in the 2022 document. So you just have to do a visual inspection and you're good to go with that. And these are your devices that contact intact skin, or your capital equipment devices that don't need analytical marker testing. Some of the global changes that I wanted to bring to your attention that you may want to address in your design history file, right? Thermal disinfection is one that we have seen grown in the last 5 years exponentially. It's growing off the charts. And the reason for that is that Europe actually requires that you have to have a thermal disinfection cycle validated for user safety. It's not because your device needs it, it's for user safety. And if it's not an end process, basically, if it's an end process, yes, of course you have to do a validation for it. But this is the intermediate process, be cleaning to sterilization, but it opens on the clean side, so the user ends are holding these devices and they want to make sure that they're safe for handling. And so we're seeing these as a requirement for any European submissions. So if you haven't yet addressed that, I highly recommend that you look at that and address that. And chemical disinfection for non-critical devices. Before, what we did is we did cleaning validations and we did disinfection validations, right? Separate validations. And so we have a longer contact time. So for 3 minutes, we won't have 3, we'll have 5 or 7 minutes. Now you can combine these into one validation, and we're only doing visuals. So we just wipe and then do the disinfection. So you can shorten that time. So if you're interested in shortening the time, we are seeing customers coming back to shorten the time for the validation. So it looks more appealing in your IFU. That is something that if you want to assess, you can assess as well. Sterilization validations. Cycles that contain the 18-minute cycle, 134C for 18 minutes. A lot of countries do have these cycles for prions. Studies have shown that they do denature that protein, so they do use that in Europe. We don't do it here in the United States, but that is a parameter that some of the countries do use. So if you don't have that, you may want to assess that for functionality, right? Because we're looking at 134 at 3 minutes for validation for sterilizations level, just 3 minutes. And now you do 18 minutes. And if you do that over and over again, your devices may break down faster. Of course, all accessories must be cleared by FDA, include wrapping material. Dry times need to be validated separately from SAL. We're seeing now legacy products that are coming, or any products before 2010 coming back, because SAL and dry time validations will perform together. But then there's a requirement that they have to be performed separately. So those are some of the findings that are happening by regulatory that need to be addressed. So you want to think about how you can work, what you need to do to mitigate that risk, and also do at least a verification test, not a full validation, but a verification test would suffice that. And cycles used for validation, here in the United States, we have 132 degrees at 4 minutes for a pre-vacuum cycle. Europe has 134 at 3 minutes. So there is a difference, and you have to validate them separately. You can use a hybrid cycle, but and when I mean by hybrid, you can use US 132 to 3 minutes of EU and say that if I can do that, everything else should suffice. It has been accepted many times, but they do question the dry times. The dry times have to be done at those temperatures. They cannot be combined at all. Only the sterilizations testing can be. Now, life cycle testing is the last thing I want to touch here regarding material compatibility and updates to your IFU. You want to ensure that your devices can withstand all the processes that you've specified in your instructions for use. If you haven't defined to the user when the device is no longer, when the user can no longer use this device, it is time to update your IFU. That is a requirement now. So you want to ensure that your IFU has some sort of instruction on when your devices can no longer be used and when they should be thrown away or discarded or given back to the OEM. I just wanted to give an outlook on some of the cycles that are out in the industry for EU. And so there's a huge broad range, but if you do 134 3 minutes for Australia reassurance, you should hit all the other countries as well. These are some of the questions that we receive daily for end-of-life testing, because it is being somewhat recommended by the EU. They're asking for that data. And if you haven't addressed the data or haven't addressed that, you want to start looking into it. FDA hasn't required it. They have talked about it, like I said in the 2015 document, but they're not requiring you to do it. And some of the questions that we see is how many times can the device be processed? What number? I mean, we say lifetime, but what's lifetime? I don't know. That's your product. You know better. So we would ask you, how many times will this device be used? You have to do some sort of an estimated calculation. Do I need to do biocompatibility after the life cycles? Do I need to do a cleaning verification test after the life cycle testing? Do I need to do functionality? We often see functionality tests associated with these. We don't see biocompatibility and we don't see cleaning. Hasn't been asked, so it hasn't been done. But we definitely see functionality. And when we see cycles performed for reusable, we see 50, 10, 100, 150. We've seen up to 500 cycles performed before on these. But the best way to do these, according to me, is at least do 100 cycles, and within every 10 cycles, pull a device out and test for the analytical tests and one for biocompatibility. That way you can grow your chart and see if anything is expanding or it's staying still, right? Do you have a solid line that's just straight line, or is it going up? And that helps you see that is there a risk or is there no risk? And it can probably help you even identify that if you did 100 and still you multiply with that, and if you have numbers, you can easily calculate how many times you can use this until it's risk to the patient. So a strategy that you probably want to note down. So for end-of-life use testing, ISO 17664 and FDA guidance document just say that the labeling should inform, which is the IFU, should inform when the user should no longer use a device. They should be able to tell just by reading, oh, this is what's happened. I need to discard this device. Oh, I need to call the manufacturer for a replacement. Things like that. If you don't have that in place, then it is something that you will be cited for. Now, on the contradictory end, we have end-of-life testing, ISO 10993-1. If you remember, we talked about biocompatibility. It's not being asked, but it is in the -1, 4.8 for reusable medical devices, biological safety shall be evaluated for maximum number of validated processing cycles. Now, if you know, shall means you have to have something. You have to have some sort of testing. So now we're starting to see EU asking for testing for that, and TÜV asking where's your validation that you perform these. Not everybody is being asked by the notified bodies, but it is something that is now being evaluated. So you want to take a look at that and see how you will be addressing this in a design history file. This is the MDR. MDR doesn't specify either, but it says information shall be provided to identify when the device should no longer be used, such as signs of material degradation, or this is where you can get away with testing, or the maximum number of allowable uses. So as long as you identify where the material degradation is happening, you don't have to do the testing. But how can you identify where the material degradation? So you have to do some sort of testing to do that. You just can't look at a brand new device and say, oh, after 10 uses, after 20, 50 uses, it's no longer good. You have to have some sort of data to estimate that. This takes me to my last slide for MDR. This is for reusable devices class 1R. So this is how reusable devices are classified for the MDR. We're classification 1R. And things to look for, right? You need to have a validation in your technical file. All of the validation that we talked about for reusable devices now have to be validated. Not verified, but validated, right? Every device should bear a UDI, right? You have to unique identification on your device, and you have to do testing that will show that it is permanent and readable after each processing. So, and its intended lifetime. So this is where the life cycle is starting to creep up here, that that is something you will have to prove, because it says shall be permanent and readable. How can you prove it will be permanent and readable after 100 cycles? So those are the things that your design history file will need to address. And Article 52, 7C also talks about devices shall be provided to identify when the device should no longer be reused, like I talked about. MDR also talks about that you have to have something in place in your IFU to show that this device is no longer usable. Now I have a date here of 27th May 2025. We were just notified that there was an extension happening for class 1R, and that's 2028. So you do have additional time to get all of this stuff done, but it is a massive thing that you have to put together in your design history file to make sure your compliance to MDR. There's a lot of information in that standard to look at for reusable, and it gives you a lot of information. So please keep that in mind. That takes me to the end of my presentation. And thank you for giving me this time to talk about design history files and the effects of it for reusable medical devices.